Okay, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for a webinar discussion on combating the challenges of medical diagnostics development in the technical solutions. Our panel will be moderated by our medical director, Paul O'Connor. And our panelists today include Erica Norton, Matt Ebbs, and John DiPiano. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please add any questions that you might have there, and we will answer them at the end of the session. And now I'll turn this over to Paul.
All right. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining. A little brief history on Boston Engineering. We have extensive experience applying a systematic approach to complex electromechanical design challenges. We have a couple of ISO certifications. We have experience designing and developing in vitro diagnostic products. We are very familiar with design controls and how they relate to IVDs. And we're an engineering consulting company with a broad range of engineering capabilities. Next slide, Rachel. This is how we think of our technologies at Boston Engineering. And we have subject matter experts that are focused on each of these centers of excellence: control systems, digital solutions, embedded systems, robotic systems, and design for manufacturing, reliability, sustainability, design for X. And next. Okay. So as an introduction to today's topic, healthcare investment has increased substantially in recent years. Investments have focused on fighting major diseases enabled by the invention of cost-effective vaccines. In addition, the demand for diagnostics has skyrocketed. The advanced diagnostics are key in determining prognosis, identifying disease stages, monitoring treatment, and assessing disease spread. Molecular-based diagnostics are critical for prevention, identification, and treatment of disease. Current laboratory testing supports diagnosis in about 70% of the diseases and can be used to aid in the continuous monitoring of drug therapy. One of the main challenges for industry is to develop fast, accurate, easy-to-use, and inexpensive devices. In addition to the improved efficiency in lab diagnostics, there has been a trend towards more decentralized diagnostics, which occurs directly at a patient bedside, outpatient clinics, or at sites of accidents, so-called point-of-care systems. These point-of-care options, they can greatly ease the burden on labor-intensive lab-based testing that require highly trained technicians. So regardless of where these tests are performed, several common challenges exist when designing, developing, and commercializing IVD equipment. That's what we're going to talk about today. And these include mechanical accuracy, temperature control, and the challenges associated with data and regulatory requirements. So these are the three segments that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to get right into the questions with our panel, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions from the audience, and feel free to submit your questions along the way and we'll address them at the end. So the first one is for John. So John, a lot of these systems include these high volume cartridges that hold the samples.
Right.
And those cartridges have enzymes and they mix with the sample in a certain way. How can you accommodate the variability that is inherent in these high volume disposable cartridges when very critical positioning is required for the optics associated with reading those results?
Right. Unlike, the high priced optical systems that need gimbal type mountings and so forth, for example, the image that you showed previously on one of the slides there, that's a point of care use home device. And basically that's a molded assembly. And what we did was we basically utilized the tolerances of the single one part mold. You try to keep all the tolerances on the same part of the mold, so the inherent tolerances is basically around the shrink of the plastic. Now, this particular plastic that we use, we had some fillers in there and so forth, which minimized the shrink, which kept things to within a few thousandths of an inch. Plus, they have them self-locating. But what we ended up doing with the disposable, that top surface is basically used as a fiducial. There's some variability in the thickness of that, the way these basically are assembled. So what we ended up doing was biasing the top surface with a flexure up to a known position on that same piece of plastic that where the camera was mounted on. So basically taking advantage of that one part with the tolerances built into the tool, that we can keep the focal distance the same. Granted, now the camera that we had a little bit of forgiveness with the depth of field and so forth and the field of view. So the XY was not as critical as the height, but we were able to accommodate that by raising every variable cartridge up to that top surface. So we knew where that plane was with pretty consistent consistency.
Okay. So, John, even though these cartridges are supposed to be the same, the design elements that you've incorporated into the
negated. Basically, it's a sandwich assembly of the cartridge itself, and in their assembly process, there was a variability of overall 28 thousandths of an inch, which is basically a mile, when you're talking this way. So what we had to do was take that top surface, and that's what we basically use as fiducial. So all the variability was below that, underneath where the camera didn't matter what the camera was looking at. So we had a flexure there that basically accommodated all that variability and just kept that top surface in the same plane where we needed it.
Okay. So all that variability likely impacts how the cartridge is read. So, and one of the elements is illumination and ambient lighting. So what can you do to inhibit the ambient lighting from entering the device in the wrong spots during the imaging, and yet maintain easy access for the user to get the cartridge into the system?
Right. I mean, larger systems, there's a door or a shade or something like that. Not to go back, but that example that we were just talking about, basically what we used was a little mechanism inside the back of the unit as the user inserted the cartridge. Unbeknownst to the user, they were activating a little lever in there that would actually drop a shade over the top end of the cartridge, which blocked the ambient light within that window, within that opening. Now you notice that in this picture, that opening has a little rectangular relief on the top side. That was due to the fact that there was two different types of cartridges where the sample well was located. On one cartridge, it was at the proximal end, and the other cartridge was actually in the center of the cartridge. So what we had to do was accommodate the opening to allow both cartridges to enter, but yet, be able to shield the ambient light. So that's where this little mechanism came in, where, the user would push the cartridge in, it would actually hit a lever, and a little shield would actually cantilever down and drop and block the light.
Okay.
So, I mean, things like that. I mean, other than a door where, it could be in the way of the user, this was a home use device, which was basically the intention was to have it, as simple as possible to use.
Right. Okay. Thanks, John.
Yep.
So Matt, these samples are exposed to heat and the environment that the sample is inside of a piece of equipment, essentially the environment, when is temperature control needed, and how and when do you know?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. So I guess there are a couple of levels of answer to that question. Most obvious is if whatever process you are designing for requires temperature control. So, for example, if you are working on an instrument that does a chemical reaction and you monitor the reaction, and that's either driven by temperature or temperature is a controlled variable in that reaction, well, then you need to start thinking about temperature control. Sometimes less obvious are the next two items. One is temperature as an unintended byproduct of whatever process you are working on. And this is especially challenging sometimes with diagnostic equipment, where we're often driving to get as much technology into as small a package as possible. All right, so John mentioned imaging systems. Cameras, tend to put off all the heat, as well as whatever motors or electronics are involved in the diagnostic process. So understanding the size of your equipment and what's going inside, you can get a good sense for that early on, and get a good sense for whether this is going to be something you have to address or can put to the side. And then finally, there's temperature or use of equipment in extreme environments. All right, so oftentimes we're designing for use in a lab or an office or someone's home where the temperature is fairly well controlled. But other times you may be designing for a military application where this could be used anywhere on Earth without sort of climate control. It really comes down to understanding the use case and the requirements, right? So it starts and ends there. And if you know sort of what you're doing and where you're doing it, that's a good first step in making sure you are adequately controlling temperature for your device.
Okay. And what decision process do you go through to choose between temperature control approaches?
Yeah. So again, the step one in that decision process is understanding the use case and understanding the product and system requirements. Then understanding sort of the environment, right? So that lets you decide, at least at a high level, between active and passive temperature control. So is it enough to put a heat sink on a microcontroller, or are you very actively trying to drive up or down temperature at fairly high powers? So there are certainly a lot of technologies available for controlling a system thermally. I think some of the first questions to ask are you heating, are you cooling, or both? That really sort of filters out some of the options. Another one is size limitations. So for example, say you have a system that you need to both heat and cool. Peltier or thermoelectric modules are very attractive because it's a small form factor, and it does both heating and cooling in a fairly simple way, but it's very inefficient. So whether you're designing a piece of equipment for a lab that's plugged into the wall, or this is a battery powered unit, or there are a lot of limitations like that might drive your decision.
Okay, very good. Back to John to talk about optics for a second. The importance of field of view and illumination. How can the optics be positioned in relation to the illumination scheme relative to the targeted zone in a cost-effective way?
Right. Again, I think what I was trying to touch upon what we were just talking about earlier was the fact that if you have an assembly and there's optics involved, if you can have a single part to take advantage of the tolerances of the process of the production, in other words, if it's a casting or if it's a molded part, You put the features in there off the same side of that tool, so there's a minimum impact of tolerance buildup. The more parts you have, there's more tolerance concerns and so forth. So other than an optic assembly that has all these fine tuning adjustments and so forth, the best way to do it at a cost-effective way is when you put all the features that mount the LEDs, or whether it's an LED or a little PC board with an illumination feature on it, with the camera, the same part on the same side of the tool. In other words, when I'm saying the A and the B half, you don't want to mount something where the part is mounted on the part of the tool on the core side and have something on the cavity side, because you're adding that tolerances of the separation of the tool into it. Keep it on the same side of the tool. That eliminates a lot of the added tolerances of assembly and of the mold process. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking advantage of the mold itself and how tight they can hold the tolerances. And as a matter of fact, you can actually, when the molder is doing the critical inspections and so forth, first article inspections, you can practically tune those dimensions that you really need. And once they're set, they're basically there, for a good quantity until you maintain the tool again.
Okay. Matt, what are some of the different safety considerations to be considered?
Sure. So whenever you're dealing with temperature, you have to give some consideration to safety. Frankly, it's really a question of risk, right? So if exceeding a temperature limit is obvious and easy to resolve and has a fairly small impact on what you're working on, then simply reporting on the temperature may be enough, right? Either logging it or just displaying it for an operator to react to if necessary. I guess the next level is setting software limits and more active alarms, right? So a lot of times these diagnostic systems will include some level of software, and understanding what thresholds should be maintained can be worked into the software to either take automated steps or simply alert an operator or someone that action needs to be taken. And then I guess at the highest level, or maybe not the highest, at the next level, limits in hardware are sort of the next step. So if software goes haywire, you still need the system to be safe from a thermal perspective, then oftentimes adding thermal fuses or hardware temperature monitoring and thresholds in the hardware rather than software is where you want to look.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And Erica, with from a regulation standpoint, what impact do the changes to performance evaluation requirements have on legacy and new products?
Sure. So I think a lot of people in the IVD space is very aware of moving from IVD-D to IVD-R. And so with this IVD-R new regulation, manufacturers with legacy products, they may need to provide additional evidence to prove safety and performance of their products, which means they may need to conduct additional tests or even clinical evidence to meet these requirements. And this actually remains the same or true for new products. And this ultimately adds cost and time to develop new products that manufacturers need to consider.
Okay. So you mentioned IVDD and IVDR. Can you describe the differences?
Sure. So the regulation, a few years ago went from, this is the European regulation, went from IVDD to IVDR, and there's several changes. And some of these include changing the classification system. There is a significant increase in notified body oversight, and there are additional requirements regarding clinical and performance evaluation.
Okay. And how has the classification system changed, and how does this impact manufacturers?
Sure. So under IVDD, so the old regulation, in vitro diagnostics were classified essentially by a list system, specifically by which conditions or pathogens a given diagnostic device was designed to diagnose. So with this new regulation, with IVDR, diagnostic devices are classified using a risk-based system. So the class type for these devices, there's going to be different levels of requirements, and it can impact manufacturing, clinical evidence, performance requirements, and conformity requirements. So some of the biggest challenges for manufacturers under IVDR is if their device changes classification, especially if it's going from, if it was at a lower class to a higher class, or I guess higher risk, which requires them to comply with stricter requirements in the aforementioned areas. So for manufacturers, it's important, to carry out a gap analysis to determine, which of their devices may have changed class type and how that will impact conformity assessment procedures and whether additional clinical evidence is needed. So doing this will allow manufacturers to develop a plan to ensure their devices comply with IVDR by the associated compliance dates. So for legacy products, there's different dates that extend, I believe, to 2025. So doing so to meet those dates is paramount.
Okay. And then how does this increased, notified body oversight impact new product development of IVDs?
Sure. So with a significant increase in notified body oversight, this essentially means there's going to be higher demand for notified bodies. And with this increase in demand, this may create a bottleneck in the process to get products to market, or even for legacy products in compliance with the regulation. So it's imperative for manufacturers to add sufficient time in their new product development schedules, or even their schedules to get their existing products in compliance to accommodate the bottleneck for a greater coordination with notified bodies to minimize the impact.
Okay, great. And switching back to John from a kind of a broad overview standpoint, from an overall development standpoint, how do you determine where to start with the concepting phases, and how does the path vary from project to project?
Well, I think Matt kind of touched upon it when he was describing the thermal things. You really need to understand the use model, and you need to have the product requirements and the product specifications in line, because those documents and the information you have from user research, if there's a use model intended, a straw man developed, that basically gives you the pathway along the whole development process. So concepting, you might have risk areas that you want to concept separately and have a few alternative designs, but you always need to understand, that path in the beginning. One of the initial things you need to do before you start concepting is understand what the end product predictions are. In other words, if you're going to develop 100,000 units or 10,000 units or 500 units or 1,000,000 units, you need to know that, because that's going to actually guide the design for, the manufacturability and how you would actually decide to design it for either automation or hand assembly, things like that. So right from the beginning, when you're concepting, you have to have design for manufacturability, design for assembly, design for safety, design for reliability, everything in the mix right from the get-go. And when you do your concepting, you're designing the product. Prototypes will come along and you decide how to prototype the product, but the design starts with concepting the product. I don't know, did that answer the question for you?
It did, and it actually leads into another question where a lot of these systems, they can be fairly low volume.
Yep.
These can be very involved pieces of equipment that can be on the expensive side.
Right.
So in terms of like the overall enclosure, like what can be done to achieve an aesthetic look or a good looking look of the device when the volumes don't justify high tooling cost and injection molds?
Right, the high price tooling. I mean, there's things that we can do. I mean, we've done things in the past where we have actually sheet metal enclosures with maybe a thermoform bezel or a cast urethane elastomeric handle that's, overmolded off of a sheet metal part. So there's different things that we could do. I mean, cast urethane is another way to do it. You can actually do a rim mold depending upon what the quantities are. So you can get that perceived high price value look with very low cost tooling and low cost initial capital investment. So, and a lot of times, a good way to do that is to utilize those techniques to actually give you like a bridge into the market. So in other words, your first offering might be a cast urethane that maybe has 20 units just to get some user feedback and so forth. And then you can make your tweaks and changes to that, which is basically low cost, before you invest in any kind of a tooling when the quantities justify it.
Okay. You've touched on a lot of elements of DFX, John. So when you're developing a device, what are some of the other concerns or considerations related to design?
I mean, I think whether it's automated or even hand assembly, the basic fundamental thing that I know that we try to do, Boston Engineering, is have single access assembly. So in other words, you want to put the first part on the table, you want the next part to drop on top of it and just build it up from there. You don't want to have to pick things up, turn them upside down, tighten a screw, flip it back over, move it on its side and things like that. You want to be able to build it from the bottom up. And I think that makes more sense when it's automated. You don't want the robots looking for different things. You want to have symmetry and have it in a single axis. I think that holds true for either low quantities where you're hand assembling it on an assembly line or in an automated production line with 40 or 50 stations. So I think that's the basic, that's really a basic way of looking at it.
Okay.
So.
And Matt, when we have this final system or subsystems, describe some of the testing versus analysis that occurs.
Sure. So testing always happens, right? Whether or not analysis happens up front, or I guess I should say what level of analysis happens up front.
Yeah.
It always ends with testing against the analysis or the simulation, testing against the specifications and requirements. In terms of how much analysis to do up front, I guess I can't emphasize enough how important experience is in making that decision. Having done similar development in the past really helps to cut down on the time it takes to chase down sort of areas of concern that may not actually be that severe. So assuming you have an experienced team working on it, it all starts with a paper study. So am I in microns or inches or feet? Am I in milliwatts, watts, or kilowatts? And that really sort of lets you highlight the areas of concern, if there are any. Then you can progress to a mathematical model like Simulink, MATLAB, or sometimes even a quick or more in-depth CFD analysis can save a lot of time. From both a complex system standpoint or a series of subsystems, or something fairly simple. You can fairly quickly find and fix challenges you have in simulation much faster than you can in hardware. But again, it all ends with testing to make sure that what you designed is meeting your requirements.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. So Rachel, it appears that we're at or over our time here. And I don't see any questions yet from the audience.
Yeah, so let's give it, if anybody
Okay.
has any questions, get them in now.
Yeah. Okay.
But if nothing comes in,
All right.
looks like we might be in good shape here then. Okay, well, then let's end it here. Thanks, Paul. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everybody for joining us. If anybody has any follow-up questions, I'll leave this slide up for a minute here. With some contact info, please feel free to reach out, and I'll also send out a recording of this to everybody, hopefully tomorrow. But thanks to everybody for joining us.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you. Have a good day.